um, and welcome you to our special session for COP26 on Judaism and the environment. And today I'm joining you from the Trinity Room for the Square because we have a very special guest with us. We're very honored to have with us Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, who's the rabbi of the New North London Synagogue. And he is someone who's taken a leading role in the development of the Masorti movement, which, if you remember when we talked about denominations, we talked a little bit about the Masorti movement. It's a traditional non-fundamentalist Judaism. And he's the senior rabbi of Masorti Judaism in the UK and president of the Council of Christian and Jews and a member of the Council of Imams and Rabbis. And he's also talking today as the co-founder of Eco-Synagogue, which is deeply engaged with environmental issues. And you can hear Rabbi Wittenberg speak on prayer on Radio 4's Prayer of the Day. I also connected you up to his webpage so you can see some of the wonderful talks and writings that he's given. So we're very honored to have Rabbi Wittenberg with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Wittenberg to speak to us about Judaism and the environment.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for welcoming me here. I'll just say something personal, first of all, which is why I appreciate this invitation particularly. And it says something about my family. Both my parents were refugees. My grandfather on my mother's side was a rabbi in Frankfurt, and his eldest daughter, they sent her to study in Zurich. In 1938, 1939, when they were finally able to flee Nazi Europe, my mother came to Glasgow because it was the only university, apparently, that welcomed such students and allowed them to continue with their studies from where they had got to. Now, she'd been in Zurich because her parents wanted her out of Germany as soon as possible. And she came to Glasgow University and completed her degree here during the war. And she had friends of hers here who are no longer alive, but until recently. So to be in the place where she studied, she died very young when I was 5. It means a lot to me. My father studied at Strathclyde University by a different route. His family fled Nazi Europe to Palestine, where he found himself involved in the British Army and then the War of Independence, and had no chance to get an education. But after he met my mother, they settled in Glasgow. And for 7 years, he studied 3 nights a week at Strathclyde University to get a degree in engineering. Often, he said, walking home after the last trains had left. So to be here is really important to me, and I appreciate it very much. I came to Glasgow for COP26, where Eco-Synagogue has had a stall yesterday in the green room, and I can't even begin to process the number of things I've learned, the challenges I realize, and the absolute urgency of the matter. If it's okay, I'll begin with the wider question I was asked, which is, for whom are we responsible from a Jewish point of view? And then I want to focus in on the environment in particular. So the sense of responsibility goes absolutely to the heart of what it means to be a human being. The first question that God asks Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is, Ayeka, where are you? The Alter Rebbe, who was the founding rabbi of Lubavitch Hasidism, really explained the question as follows. Where are you? Where is each one of us in our life? What are we doing with our time on earth? What have we achieved in terms of the capacities we've been given and the opportunities we have had? Have we maximized that? So the primary responsibility is of every individual as an individual before God, and there are no bounds to that responsibility. We're asked to use the opportunity for this life in the best possible way that we can. And the much quoted verse from Deuteronomy, which makes part of the Jewish daily liturgy morning and evening, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. One of the interpretations at B'chol Mo'odecha, with every opportunity that life offers, with every challenge that life offers. So that's obviously somewhat demanding. And then there's a sense of being responsible within one's own community. And as in many religious traditions, that's very strong in Judaism. And community means horizontal community and vertical community. So it's very interesting that key prayers, it's actually been a challenge during lockdown, are only allowed in a quorum, traditionally a quorum of 10 men, in my community and many others, 10 people over the age of 12 or 13, so that one is bound and connected to community for one's most basic Jewish life. And I think that's why the Jewish people in all its exiles in different lands has been able to recreate community and replicate a way of life that's become sort of, as it were, exterritorial, in that it can be established effectively anywhere, as it is in Glasgow and other places in Scotland. And when that sense of responsibility is discussed, the Talmud has the phrase, Kol Yisrael arevin ze lazeh, all Jewish people are responsible one to another, so that to remove oneself from community is seen as unjust and actually irresponsible towards one's fellow Jews. There's also a sense of being answerable across time. And this is a very powerful hold, psychologically and spiritually, on many Jewish people, including a lot of people who are not engaged in contemporary community, who are not religious, who wouldn't describe themselves as such, but this sense of belonging to a people who are effectively a people of survivors, a people who have lived in many exiles and being beholden to the past to carry it on. Now, this can be perceived and experienced by people as a burden, as one inherits a history of the Nazi Holocaust, among other things, and anti-Semitism. But it's also profoundly inspiring. I will often think about my grandparents, my great-grandfather, whom I didn't know, but whose teachings I've come to know in difficult moments, and feel myself connected, but also responsible. Am I using, as best I can, understanding, studying, and applying the ethical and spiritual heritage that I received? But going beyond that, and in a way it's primary, earlier than this bond between God and the Jewish people, traditionally understood as at Sinai, is a bond between all humanity and all creatures. And that's traditionally understood as what God said to Noah under the sign of the rainbow. This is my covenant that I establish between me and you and all living beings. And that all living beings phrase I find very moving at this point in time. It's not just because I am actually a nature lover, the love of animals and a love of trees and a love of forests. I stole away from the conference to get to Balach and have a bit of a walk by Loch Lomond the day before yesterday, but because this is our relationship with Earth itself. But before I come to the particularly sort of non-human environmental, which is only one, in fact, perhaps even one part of what COP is about, I want to talk about a responsibility towards our fellow human beings, whoever they are. I can do this in terms of a couple of stories, biblical stories with their Talmudic, rabbinic analysis. Noah and Abraham are often compared, usually not in Noah's favor, because God commands Noah to save biodiversity by taking two of every kind onto the ark. But he's criticized because Noah actually says nothing. The Torah says, the book of Genesis says, and Noah did what God commanded. It doesn't say Noah questioned or Noah challenged, which are such classic Jewish things. The meta language of rabbinic text is full of words of challenge and questioning. He just did. So why did you accept? Why didn't you argue? What did you do or say to your contemporaries? And that silence is considered damning. One has to speak out. It's an obligation to commit oneself to the challenges which face humanity at large. And Abraham, by contrast, is understood as having challenged God by speaking out about the destruction of Sodom. There's no suggestion that, although his nephew lived there, that he was doing it purely for the reasons of his family. He says, if there are 50 righteous people, 40, and so on, down to the number of 10, he argues and bargains with God. And an interesting phrase that was picked up by the medieval commentator Abraham ibn Ezra, who was born in Spain, I think in the 11th century. He actually visited Britain, visited England. We know that because when he talks about Mount Sinai and the thunder and lightning over it, he says, I've seen such weather in England. So he comments on the phrase that Abraham uses, if there are 50 righteous in the midst of the city. And it's a principle of rabbinic exegesis that there's no redundancy in the Torah. So we know it's Sodom. So what's the point of in the midst of the city? And he says, engaged in the affairs of the city. And the modern biblical commentator, Nechama Leibovitz, says, it's all very well having good people who don't engage. There's a Yiddish phrase for it, tzaddik im pelz, a righteous person in a fur coat. What really matters is to commit and to engage. And then perhaps one will make a difference to what is happening around one. So that's a very powerful piece, that we're not at liberty to fail to engage. And that climate is one of the huge issues we face. Many of the others are deriving from it, particularly the refugee crisis. And my mother was welcomed to this city as a refugee, so I feel very, very strongly and I'm quite engaged about that. But we're not allowed to be silent. And the Jewish people has had a lot of experiences of seeing others be bystanders, and therefore often quoted is, you shall not stand silently by the blood of your brother. I'll move from this to a relationship with the earth itself and environment, but it is a little bit of a distraction, which, in circles I'm in, sometimes we think about this as about biodiversity, preserving forests, the purity of the oceans, extinction and so on. But actually, absolutely key to COP is climate justice. And in fact, the absence of so many of the voices of those who are both the victims of climate injustice in Central and Southern America, Central Africa, Indonesia, Pacific Islands, because they couldn't get here because of vaccination issues, and then the cost of travel, and then the cost of accommodation in Glasgow. So there's justice within justice of how do you raise the issue of justice in a just way. And it's very prominent at COP. But just to talk about relationship for a moment beyond the human, this covenant with Noah is understood as with all living beings. So there is a responsibility towards life, all life in which we are interdependent. The American biblical scholar Ellen Davis, who's got a wonderful book, which I'd warmly recommend, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, writes about the meaning of the first instruction to Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, I think it's 2:9, I might have got that reference wrong, in which God puts Adam in the garden, in Hebrew, le'ovda hu le'shomra. It's usually translated to work it and keep it. And the garden is seen as a kind of metaphor for the whole world. Our duty is we can work the world, but we also need to keep and preserve it. But she hones the meaning of these two Hebrew verbs. She's an excellent Hebraist, although I think a Protestant herself, a Protestant thinker. And she notes that the word avod or avodah is not just used with regard to work or sometimes slavery, like the slavery in Egypt. It's used most prominently in terms of worship. So she says to work the world in a spirit of deep respect as God's world. And she then does the same kind of treatment with l'shomra. Now, l'shomer can be a keeper, somebody to whom you lend something for safekeeping. It's used that way in the Torah. But much more frequently, it's used of keeping God's commandments. Ushmartem et hamitzvot. You shall keep the commandments. So she says this is kind of a religious duty, a spiritual duty of reverence towards being guardians and trustees of the earth, because it's largely in the power of human hands. Just taking a bit of an aside from this to just an incident that happened as I was leaving COP. can't remember now, it was muddling my days. It was yesterday. So there's a huge police presence around it, around the science center and the blue zone and the green zone that people will have noted. As I was coming to that bridge that crosses the Clyde at an angle, a swan descended rather swiftly, and it was quite clear that it was somehow injured. And it landed in the midst of a large group of policemen, a bit of a diversion from what they might have felt they were really there for. It sat still for a few moments, and then it got up and waddled, so it wasn't fatally injured. It had some sort of injury. And then the policeman sort of protected it, and clearly, everybody was taking pictures. It was quite a scene. There was something symbolic about the sense that the world of nature has landed within our trusteeship, and we have the ability to harm it or heal it. It was a very, very moving moment, actually, in an absurd kind of way. So COP has left me with these one with profound challenges. The story, I'll tell this story and then perhaps I'll give a pause. I haven't even looked at time, I apologize for that. A much quoted rabbinical parable, which I question how it's used. The parable it's about responsibility and mutual responsibility of a boat in which a group of people, many people will be familiar with this. And one person's drilling a hole under their seat. And everybody else says, "What are you doing? How are you doing that?" And this person says, "Well, it's my seat." So this is used as a symbol for mutual responsibility. But I have some challenges with that parable. First of all, we like to think that we're the person who's saying, "Stop drilling that hole." But we're also the person making that hole. And sometimes we're the person making the hole with our left hand while holding up a protest sign with our right hand and doing both. And unless the leaders of governments, Boris Johnson spoke very well at the opening of COP, unless they mean what they say, unless that's stated in measurable terms with a sense of who is going to watch and hold to account the commitments and promises made and those which still have to be made, effectively what will continue is people saying stop with a sign in their right hand and making the hole with their left hand. The other thing is that the suggestion is everybody's in the boat equally, and when a boat goes down, everybody goes down at the same time. The back end of that boat, I shouldn't really use the metaphor of back and forwards, I don't mean to sort of preference one over another in terms of values, is already underwater. One of the most stirring things I heard at the Talanoa Dialogue, which is a structured interfaith, United Nations structured interfaith dialogue, was a bishop of the Southern Pacific Islands, noting that rising sea levels are already eroding substantial parts of small islands and will wipe them out altogether in the foreseeable short-term future. He said, "I've got two questions for you," he said to this mixed faith audience. Am I your neighbor, as in love your neighbor as yourself? And as in the question that God asks Cain, are you my keeper? So these are hugely challenging questions. I went up to him afterwards and said, if I want to be your keeper, and I live in London, you're in the South Pacific, what do I have to do? What meaning can one attach to being a keeper? And he said, divest from fossil fuels. That's number one. But I need time to just process the various actions and the urgency, and then ask questions, who's one responsible for? In any position of leadership, one has a responsibility for what one says, does, and encourages others to do. What is a compelling, positive path one can take communities on, which isn't just about fear and don't do and disempowerment, to lead to significant change in a short period of time? Because although 2050 is talked about for net zero, there's consensus that it's really the next 10, at most 10 to 15 years. It's where we're at 2030, 2035, which is really going to count. So it's a very, very sharp responsibility. It's a responsibility to humanity as a whole. It's a responsibility to nature. It's a responsibility to God's world. It's also very close to home. It's a responsibility towards our own children and towards the future. And rarely, as it were, has the future so obviously been in the hands of the present. So I think I'm going to pause there and see if people have particular questions, because I'm aware I'm talking to a group of people I haven't met, and I apologize for that. And I could easily be talking about things that are not relevant. So please do put questions in the chat or ask them, or tell me sort of which directions you want me to sort of go a bit further in. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for a very moving speech. This is really, like, I believe myself that I work a lot for the climate. I try to avoid fossil fuels. I don't eat meat. I try to do as much as I can on an individual scale. But the way you've described your relationship with Judaism and the environment and the way that we should solve it, I really think should be heard on larger speakers. The only question that I have is that you were at one point talking about Moses and how he was, he didn't challenge God when he...
Noah.
Noah, sorry, not Moses. Why, is there a certain explanation that you could give as to why somebody must challenge maybe the word of God? Because you seem to praise Abraham when he challenged the word of God, but at least in, maybe it's the way I've studied it, but a lot of the time the word of God is absolute. Therefore, doesn't seem to be any reason for you to counter it. If God is omnipotent and knows everything, they should be able to have correct judgment over any situation that happens on earth in their creation.
It's a great question. Can I just come to the first part of what you said? I appreciate your words. I've been at several interfaith events, including the vigil in George Square on Sunday. And what is so apparent is that although we're each drawing from our faiths on different texts, there's a huge consensus in what it is that we feel we're being asked to do and speak up and speak out about, so that they've found allies in, across the faiths, which and we plan to build together, because there's an understanding, I think it's correct, that voices together from different faiths are much more powerful than on their own. And also within the climate science and environmental sectors, there's a realization that faiths have opportunities. First of all, faiths have visions and a sense of individual and collective responsibility, but also the ability to mobilize, because 80% of the world's population, it's said, belong to a faith, and faith groups meet and listen sometimes, and can collectively mobilize. And also a very large number of educational institutions, particularly schools, are faith-based. So it was both inspiring and renewed the challenge to be a part of that. In terms of your question about God, perhaps I should say a little bit more about this scenario put before Abraham. So when it comes to a commandment like love your neighbor or welcome, let the refugee who comes to you dwell in your midst, that the rabbinic question is not there, well, kind of, why should I, God? It is, what exactly does that mean? So the questioning is, how do I drill down into the practicalities of it? It's actually very relevant to COP, because I had this very instructive conversation with one of the Christian leaders from Arotcha, Andy Atkins, who said, what are you here for? So I asked him, what are you here for? He said, to follow in detail the negotiations, to know where they stand, to know exactly whom to lobby about what, because unless there is strict monitoring, there will be no pathway between here and 2020 and 2030. So that rabbinic kind of questioning, what exactly does this mean, is very relevant. But it's a bit different with Abraham, because just before Abraham intervenes for Sodom, God says, shall I conceal from Abraham what it is that I'm about to do? I have known him in that he will command his household after him to do justice and righteousness. And then we're told, this rather anthropomorphic language of the biblical narrative, God descended. So it's as if God puts a question mark in telling Abraham, and commenting on that, the rabbis note that God has instructed Abraham not walk with me, which is how Noah is described, but walk before me. And they have this very daring metaphor in rabbinic midrash of the king walking through a dark alleyway. It's got wrong in the text. That's my fault. I apologize. And he asks his most trusted servant to carry a lamp in front of him. That's Abraham. Elsewhere, he's called my agent, my minister on earth, who has to report back. So this is a position of trust in terms of what's happening. And it's as if God is saying to Abraham, this is my intention, but what do you think? So perhaps in terms of omnipotence, predestination, and free will, the point is here, this is an opportunity given, if you like, by God to exercise free will and say, but is that right? And Abraham is very daring. He says, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Now the question is whether one believes in such an omnipotent God, or whether we believe. It's a wonderful, wonderful diary entry by Etty Hillesum in 1942. She's Dutch young woman, and she has to leave Amsterdam. She loves her native city. And she writes about God. She doesn't write a lot about God, but in this entry she writes about God and said, I can't blame you. There's not much you can do about it, God. All I can do is preserve this little bit of God that's in me and perhaps help with a bit of God in others. That's what we can do. As if to say, God, you've entrusted to us, and now we have to make the best we can. Perhaps that a better framing of the challenge than, as it were, this is God's word, and God, I dare to disagree with you. I don't know if that helps at all. It's a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, it helps. I wasn't aware of the story with Abraham, and I think that's where the confusion came from. But thank you very much for speaking on this topic.
I didn't explain it beforehand. I'm very glad if other people have got thoughts or questions, or Mia, if you want to direct me in a particular way.
Rabbi Jonathan, could I just ask a question before perhaps we move to the next bit? I was really interested in how you briefly mentioned the story of Cain and Abel, and in particular the question, am I my brother's keeper? And of course that's played a big role, I feel, in believers, either Christian or Jewish, responsibilities towards their fellow man or woman. And as somebody training for Christian ministry, I've dealt with that text a little bit in terms of our duties towards our neighbour. When we look at the story of creation, sort of found in the Pentateuch and in Christian Genesis, where do you think the balance is between a responsibility to look after God's creation and the perhaps slightly erroneous belief that God has given us creation? It's something I've heard a few times that, God has placed mankind in charge of creation. It's ours to do with as we want. Whereas I think certainly what you were saying and what other people have said, it feels much more like a stewardship than an ownership. Where do you think we stand on that, please?
So that's a great question. I might come back to the Cain and Abel piece, but just to begin with that, Genesis 1, which uses the word milu et haaretz v'kivshuha, fill the earth and literally conquer it, overcome it, kind of. I was at a talk at an anti-faith panel last night in which this was understood as the combination of this kind of religious text with colonialism led to the slave trade. And we're living in a way in the legacy of the slave trade. We're not formally trading in slaves, although slavery is rife in the world in a whole range of different channels. But effectively, we're doing something rather similar with the mineral, agricultural wealth and the labor wealth of so many parts of the world, which is a comment again by the Bishop of the Southern Pacific. I came across the words, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof," twice in people quoting it here, and once on the building of the Bank of England in London. How dare they, he said. How dare they? It was a very... But Jewish teaching has focused far more on Genesis 2 as the source of the obligation, as I said before, to work the earth in a spirit of reverence and to preserve it. And repeated biblical text affirms that rather than a sense of ownership and mastery. We're in a sabbatical year in the Jewish cycle of years at the moment, the Shemitah year, in which we're told that the earth shall rest an earth to the Lord, and that li haaretz, the earth is mine. You can be a tenant, but you don't have freehold. There's a very, very clear statement of to whom the earth belongs. So that, that's where I think Judaism stands and how rabbinic Judaism has seen it. And perhaps, and I say this with some caution, you might not agree, Judaism has a very long tradition of reading scripture through rabbinic eyes. So it may appear to have the most prominence if you go neat to the text of the Hebrew Bible, is not what ends up being the most informative comment in terms of rabbinic and Jewish thinking. And in a way, rabbinic thinking created Judaism. So I don't know if that helps address that issue, but we certainly have to deal with the legacy of dominion and the fact that we're part of it. One of the things that fair trade labels alert one to is how much trade is unfair trade, for example, just one example. I want to return to your comment about Cain and Abel as well, because this verse is, I think, fascinating and difficult, and particularly because one tends to take the second half of God's response to Cain without the first half. So the second half is, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Everybody is familiar with that. That's Cain's answer back to God, The first half is, "I don't know." So that there's no more blunt denial of responsibility than that. And it leads one to think that if we do know, if one isn't going to be in the position of saying, "I don't know where my brother is, I don't know who my brother is, and frankly, I don't care who my brother is," then one is much more likely not to deny that one is one's brother or sister's keeper and that one has responsibility. But I end up wondering whether that's true. One of my teachers, Rabbi Hugo Grin, he's not been alive now these 15 years, he was often on Radio 4, he was an Auschwitz survivor, would say, the business of a society is to celebrate difference so that we know one another, and we can't say, "I don't know." But I'm also concerned that we treat people we do know and peoples we have known and lived next to as neighbors, sometimes with appalling hostility. But at COP, one of the features that must be attended to and focused on is who wasn't there. And justice is also procedural justice. So if one's going to talk about climate justice, one has to say who couldn't get there, whose voices were not heard, often from the global south, often not from people who are white, often from people who are younger, often from women. And if we don't listen, we won't know. And if we don't know, we won't even realize that actually these people have the claim of fellow humanity, brotherhood or sisterhood on us. So it's one of the things I'm very much taking away to think about is what climate justice actually means. So it's a bit of, again, a long-winded answer going back to the climate question. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Yes, that does. And it was particularly moving, I thought, yesterday in the news, seeing how the Israeli disabled minister, how she was unable to access part of the COP talks because of accessibility issues for her and her wheelchair, and how, such a small thing stopped this lady from attending and participating, and just wondering how many other accessibility in a wider sense issues we risk overlooking in these things. There's a hymn in Christianity which says, as long as people hunger, as long as people thirst, and ignorance and illness and warfare do their worst, as long as there's injustice in any of God's lands, I am my brother's keeper and dare not wash my hands. And this, it's quite powerful when you think about it, how we do have this responsibility for people, even if we don't know them.
Yeah. And there's also a piece about where solutions, whatever solutions we're able to offer, will come from, and who will be able to affect them, and the danger of top-down solutions which don't take into account populations in different places, their needs, their livelihoods, and engagement in the project in particular. So sitting with Andy Atkins of Arocha, he was saying the commitment to end deforestation by 2030 sounds great, but we don't know what it means. At best, it will mean that people work out a pathway to get from here to there, monitor it, scrutinize it, and pay for it. That's the optimum. But it can also mean that the, albeit limited but significant money put aside for it, will be accessed by governments. For instance, Brazil has signed up to this in spite of Bolsonaro, but he might be able to take it and use it while at the same time disempowering indigenous peoples. So everything relies on, as he said, holding the feet of government to the fire. Yeah. A different question before I gather we should stop in about 7 or 8 minutes.
I have a question.
Please.
Because I notice it's quite politically themed as well. So you mentioned climate justice, and following politics for a long time now, I think the problem is that we always assume that our intentions are paramount. So let's say the world governments agree that they're going to put aside 3% or 5% of their GDP or tax people more to fight this, and it still nothing happens. Then I think we have a responsibility to look at that and say the effects are not what we planned. And my theory is that this is a kind of a tax racket more than it is a climate change thing. So having followed politics for a long time, it is not inconceivable that what a politician says and what the result is the opposite. So I'll just caution against a blanket, everything's good, the intention is paramount, because I definitely am a proponent of thinking beyond this stage one. Stage one being intention, stage two being implementation, and stage three being the consequences. I think the consequences, the prudence of that, to look at the consequences, I think that is the real justice. The intention is not the justice. The consequences is justice. So I'll just caution looking beyond stage one to be paramount.
I really agree with you. And the question then is an interesting question is, who is responsible for doing whatever it is we can, and there's a limited amount we can do, to ensure that there's a move from intention to action, and that action is well guided. The consequences, then there's always elements that one can't foresee in the consequences. But I wrote a piece in The Guardian following the budget, because having listened to professed intentions, the last budget ran counter to them in where it put the money. And putting one's money where one's mouth is one step. in terms of taking one's intentions into one's actions. So it is an extremely real worry. And then actions where there isn't really a lot of listening as to what their consequences might be can have consequences that are negative and unforeseen. They may have been foreseen, actually. They can sometimes be foreseen, but are negative. I'm trying to think of biblical texts that would actually frame that theologically. It's interesting that in general, in rabbinic thought, the rabbinic phrase is hirhur lav milta. It's a Talmudic thought. Thoughts are not things. In other words, we're not on the whole judged on our thoughts. We're judged on the outcomes of those thoughts, on our actions, rather than on our intentions. Obviously, intentions influence actions, and thoughts fill the mind and direct the mind. But ultimately, it's what we do that is critical. So I very much agree with what you said.
So going on this, then would a rabbi disagree with? I guess this would be a controversial question, because I think I'm going to butcher this quote, but it's Jesus says something like, if you are angry with your brother, you have already sinned. But a rabbi would not agree with that. Would he?
No, I mean, there's some critical differences here. I mean, I don't know how Christian theology has interpreted that or what it does. But it's actions. Sometimes words constitute actions, because sometimes speech is an act. But no, it's not. Or in other words, lust in the heart is not the same as lust in deed. So rabbinic thinking will focus far more on action, because it's understood that in our minds all sorts of thoughts go through. The rabbis understood that we all have a yetzer hara, a kind of a drive and an id and an inclination to follow our own willfulness and appetite, and that the key thing is how we control that and manage that and what we then do. So I think there's shades of difference here, but I'm a little bit cautious. I'm always a bit nervous about sort of trying to underline differences in approaches between faiths, because the only faith I know to any extent at all, limited extent, is my own.
Well, I think I join everyone, Rabbi Wittenberg, in thanking you for an inspirational talk, for joining us today in what I'm sure is a very busy schedule. And we're really honored to have you enlighten us with your talk and your views, and to share with us these perspectives of Judaism and the environment.